You must not go to the mill. The Duke warned her 3 times before she ever set foot inside the mill. He genuinely believed what he was telling her.
He wasn't being cruel. That's what she'd tell people later when they asked why she hadn't simply refused the whole arrangement and walked away with what little pride remained to her. He genuinely believed what he was telling her. "You'll lose everything, Mrs. Foss. The looms are silent, the workers are gone, the debts alone will swallow whatever you have left." He was right about the looms. He was right about the workers. He was wrong about everything else. 3 years later, the same man stood in her doorway, asking, with considerably less certainty in his voice than he'd once carried, whether she might consider selling it back. The solicitor's chambers in Chelmsford smelled of dust and old varnish, the particular smell of a room where difficult arithmetic had been performed in every corner of it for 100 years running, and Eleanor Foss sat very straight in the chair provided for her, her hands folded in her lap, and listened to a stranger read out the whole of what her husband had left behind. Not much of it was good. Thomas Foss had been a silk weaver's son who'd married above his station and spent the better part of 11 years trying to prove himself worthy of the leap, and in the trying he had borrowed considerably more than his trade could ever hope to repay, and died of a fever in his 40th year, owing £460 to men who did not extend patience on account of grief. What remained to Eleanor, after every reasonable claim against the estate had been settled, was a single property. Ravensmere Silk Mill, on the edge of a village called Thorncombe, some 14 miles from where she now sat. "The mill has stood idle these past 2 years," the solicitor said, not quite meeting her eye, "since the previous proprietor's failure. His Grace acquired the freehold as part of a broader settlement some years back, and has held it since without particular use for it. He has agreed, given the circumstances of your husband's debts to certain parties associated with his own estate, to transfer the mill to you outright, in full and final settlement." "Why?" Eleanor asked. The solicitor glanced briefly toward the man seated near the window, who had said nothing throughout the entire proceeding, and who now turned from whatever he'd been studying in the street below to look at her directly for the first time. Duke Aldous Rothburn was younger than she'd expected, though his manner carried the particular weariness of a man who had inherited considerably more responsibility than patience for it. "Because it costs me nothing to be rid of it," he said plainly. "The mill is worthless, Mrs. Foss. I've had 2 separate assessors examine it in the past 18 months. The looms want considerable repair. The workforce scattered when the previous proprietor's failure became public, and I'm told few of them have any inclination to return, given how badly that failure ended for the wages owed them. I offer it to you not out of any particular generosity, but because a worthless property costs me nothing to give away, and it may spare you the indignity of leaving this room with nothing at all." Eleanor considered this for a long moment. "You believe I'll fail," she said. "I believe the mill has already failed," the Duke corrected, rather thoroughly and rather publicly. "I would be doing you a disservice if I allowed you to imagine otherwise before you'd signed anything binding. You'll lose whatever you put into it, Mrs. Foss. I say that not to discourage a decision that is in any case entirely yours to make, but because I've watched enough men ruin themselves chasing a mill's old reputation to feel some obligation towards honesty on the subject." "I have very little left to lose," Eleanor said. "I find that considerably steadies the nerves when a man warns me of losing it." Something in the Duke's expression shifted, not quite surprise, but close enough to it that Eleanor noted the change and filed it away, the way she had learned across 11 years of a marriage that had taught her considerably more about careful observation than it had ever taught her about silk. "You may have the mill, then," he said. "Freehold, unconditional, no further claim against you or your late husband's name. I'll have the papers drawn up by the weekend." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "Don't thank me yet," the Duke said. "Thank me if you're still standing in that mill 3 years from now with something worth the name of a business. I confess I don't expect to be troubled with the obligation." He rose, buttoned his coat, and left the room without further ceremony, and Eleanor sat alone with the solicitor and the weight of a warning she had already, in the privacy of her own mind, begun deciding not to heed. The carriage that carried her to Thorncombe 3 days later arrived considerably later in the afternoon than she'd hoped, the roads slower than the driver had anticipated, and by the time the mill itself came into view, the light had already begun its slow retreat toward evening, throwing long shadows across a building considerably larger and considerably more derelict than she had let herself imagine from the solicitor's brief description. 4 stories of dark brick, windows broken across the entire upper floor, a mill race running alongside it, choked with weeds and stagnant water, where a wheel should have been turning steadily to power the looms within. She stood in the overgrown yard for a long moment, looking up at the silent building, and did not allow herself, even then, alone and unwatched, the indulgence of doubt. She had buried a husband 4 months before. She had sat in a cold chamber and been told plainly that she would lose everything she attempted to build here. She had, she reminded herself, very little left that losing could actually take from her. The interior proved worse than the exterior had prepared her, and Eleanor spent her first full day at Ravensmere simply walking its 4 floors with a lantern, cataloguing damage the way she had once as a girl catalogued her own father's modest textile accounts before her marriage had carried her into circles that considered such labor beneath a lady's proper attention. The ground floor housed the great looms themselves, 12 of them, silent and shrouded in 2 years of dust, several with broken heddles and warping frames gone slack from disuse. The second floor held the winding and spinning apparatus in somewhat better condition, protected by its distance from the broken windows above. The third floor, she discovered, had once served as a design room, and here, in a locked cabinet she had to force open with an iron bar borrowed from the empty stables, she found her husband's own trade connection to the place laid bare in a manner she had not expected. Pattern books. Dozens of them, bound in worn leather, filled with careful drawings of silk weaves, damask patterns, brocade designs rendered in exacting detail, the particular hand of someone who had genuinely loved the craft rather than merely profited from it. Thomas's hand. Her husband had trained here, she understood now, turning the pages by lantern light with hands that had gone suddenly and uncharacteristically unsteady. Before his family's modest fortune carried him toward the marriage that eventually ruined him, Before the borrowing and the desperate schemes and the fever that took him in his 40th year, Thomas Foss had been, simply and honestly, a silk weaver's apprentice at this very mill, and had left behind in this locked cabinet a record of exactly how much genuine skill the trade had once demanded of him before ambition had carried him somewhere considerably less honest. She did not weep over the pattern books. She had decided in that cold Chelmsford chamber that she would not give anyone, including her own private grief, the satisfaction of watching her come apart over what could not be undone. She closed the cabinet carefully and carried 3 of the books downstairs and began the following morning the long work of understanding exactly what her husband had once known and she herself did not yet fully grasp. It was on her 4th morning at the mill, examining the great wheel's mechanism where it sat rusted and silent above the choked mill race, that she found the cat. Thin, gray, one ear torn ragged along its edge, watching her from a gap in the stonework with the wary, unblinking patience of a creature that had survived considerably longer alone than anyone would have predicted for something so small and so evidently unloved. She did not approach it. She simply continued her inspection of the wheel mechanism, and over the following days noticed the cat watching from progressively closer distances, until by the end of the first week it had taken to sitting on the sill of the design room's one unbroken window while she worked through her husband's pattern books, close enough to observe, far enough that neither of them felt any particular obligation to test the other's patience. "Millers used to keep cats here against the rats," said the one remaining villager who still lived close enough to the mill to trouble himself with visiting her, an elderly man named Obadiah Rowe, who had worked the looms himself decades before, and now lived on a small pension in a cottage half a mile down the lane. "That one's called Bobbin, or she was, back when there were still hands enough here to trouble naming her. She stayed on after everyone else left. I couldn't rightly tell you why." "Perhaps she'd nowhere else to go," Eleanor said. "Perhaps," Obadiah agreed, "though I'd wager it's more that she never stopped believing the wheel might turn again. Cats are patient creatures, Mrs. Foss, when they've decided a thing is worth the waiting." Eleanor looked at the cat, watching her steadily from the window-sill, and found something in Obadiah's observations settling into her with a familiarity she did not trouble to examine too closely that particular morning, though she would return to the thought considerably more than once across the difficult months that followed. She began her repairs with the wheel itself, understanding from her father's own modest accounts and from careful inquiry among the few remaining tradesmen willing to take a widow's coin, that nothing else in the mill would matter until the water could once again be made to turn power through the whole silent structure. The cost was considerable against what little she had. £9 for a millwright from the county town to assess and begin repairing the wheel's mechanism, £4 for clearing the choked mill race, work she undertook herself along with 2 of the village boys Obadiah recommended, wading into cold water with rakes and shovels through most of a bitter autumn week. She recorded every shilling in a ledger she had bought with nearly the last of her ready coin, the same discipline her father had taught her as a girl, and found, working through the figures each evening by candlelight, the exercise steadied her in a way little else had managed since her husband's death. The wheel turned again in November, slowly at first, groaning against months of disuse, and Eleanor stood at the mill race's edge and felt something she had not expected to feel again quite so soon, something close to hope. Bobbin sat on the stonework beside her the entire time, watching the wheel with the same patient attention she brought to everything, and did not move until the sound had settled into something steady and reliable, the mill, however faintly, beginning once more to remember what it had been built to do. Winter settled hard over Thorncombe that year, and Eleanor spent the coldest months of it working through her husband's pattern books by candlelight, teaching herself, page by page, the trade he had left behind before ambition had carried him elsewhere, and beginning to understand, as the weeks accumulated, that the books contained considerably more than simple record-keeping. Thomas had been developing something. Buried among the more conventional damask and brocade patterns, in the final third of the last book were pages of considerably stranger design, sketches of a modified draw-loom mechanism that appeared, as far as Eleanor could determine from her still limited understanding of the craft, to allow a single weaver to produce complex figured silk considerably faster than the traditional apparatus permitted, without requiring the second worker traditionally needed to manage the pattern draws by hand. She did not fully understand the mechanism. She understood enough to know it mattered. She wrote to Obadiah Rowe first, showing him the sketches over tea in his small cottage, and watched the old weaver's face change as he studied the pages with the particular attention of a man encountering unexpectedly evidence of genuine innovation from a source he had not thought capable of it. "Your husband drew this," Obadiah said, not quite a question. "He did. He was apprenticed here, you understand, before my time properly began, but I heard talk of him still, years after. A quiet boy, careful hands. Nobody thought much of him beyond that, as I recall, though I confess I never saw work of his own design before this moment." He turned the page carefully, studying the mechanism's sketched detail. "This would want a skilled millwright to build properly, and considerable testing before I'd trust it against a paying commission. But if it does what these drawings suggest it might, Mrs. Foss, you're sitting on something considerably more valuable than a mill full of ordinary looms." "How valuable?" Eleanor asked. Obadiah considered the question carefully. "Enough that I'd not be telling every passing tradesman about it until you've had it built and proven properly," he said. "There's men in this county who'd think nothing of taking a good idea from a widow who couldn't yet defend it in a court of law." Eleanor did not weep over that particular warning, though she understood, hearing it, exactly how precarious her position genuinely was. A widow, alone, with no legal standing beyond what the law grudgingly extended to a woman managing property in her own name, and even that standing, she had learned, through careful and increasingly worried inquiry to a solicitor in the county town, remained considerably less certain than she had assumed when she first signed the freehold papers. The law of coverture, as it applied to a widow rather than a wife, granted her rather more independence than a married woman would have possessed, true enough, But the mill's freehold, she discovered upon closer examination of the original transfer papers, carried a clause she had not properly understood at the time of signing, a reversion clause common enough in such transfers, stipulating that should the property be found within 5 years of transfer to have been abandoned or allowed to fall into disrepair beyond reasonable use, ownership would revert automatically to the Duke's estate without further legal proceeding required. She signed it in that cold Chelmsford chamber without fully appreciating what it meant, grief and exhaustion having dulled her usual careful attention to the precise language of any document placed before her. She understood it now, reading it a second time by candlelight, with rather more clarity than the discovery comfortably allowed. She had 3 years and some months remaining before the clause's protection expired entirely, before the mill would stand in the law's own eyes as fully and unconditionally hers, regardless of whatever the Duke might later think of her success or failure. 3 years to prove the mill was not, as everyone had assured her it would be, merely a slow and inevitable ruin. She hired a millwright from Colchester that same month, a careful and skeptical man named Josiah Kemp, who examined Thomas's sketches for the better part of 2 full days before he finally admitted, with evident reluctance, that the mechanism might genuinely work as drawn. "It'll cost you considerably more than the wheel repair did," Kemp warned her. "The parts alone want precision work I can't manage cheaply, and there's no guarantee, Mrs. Foss, that the finished mechanism performs as well in practice as it does on paper. I've seen cleverer drawings than this come to nothing once the actual metal and timber were involved." "I understand the risk," Eleanor said. "Build it regardless. I've very little left to lose that building it doesn't already risk losing regardless." Kemp studied her a long moment, the way Obadiah had studied her weeks before, and something in his expression suggested he had, despite his professional skepticism, arrived at a private conclusion regarding her character that he did not trouble to voice aloud. "Very well," he said. "I'll want payment in stages as the work progresses, and I'll want your word you'll not go showing these drawings to any other millwright in the county before the work's finished, given what you've told me of the reversion clause hanging over you." "You have my word," Eleanor said. The construction took the better part of that entire spring, Kemp working alongside 2 apprentices he trusted. Eleanor recorded every shilling in her ledger with the same careful discipline she had applied to the wheel's repair, the figures accumulating steadily against a total that made her chest tighten each time she reviewed it by candlelight. Bobbin took to sleeping in the design room through those long spring months, curled near the stove Eleanor kept burning against the evening chill while she worked through Thomas's drawings, and Eleanor found herself more than once speaking aloud to the cat as she worked, the way a person speaks to something that listens without judgment, testing sentences and calculations against the small, patient audience the cat provided before she committed them to her ledger's careful pages. The mechanism was finished in June, mounted onto the limb's largest and best maintained loom, and Eleanor stood beside Josiah Kemp on the morning of its first proper trial, her hands folded tightly in front of her, watching as the loom, powered now by the wheel's steady turning, began to weave a complex figured pattern that would, under the old apparatus, have required two skilled hands working in careful coordination to produce at half the speed. The silk that emerged, hour by hour, across that first full day of trial was flawless. Eleanor did not weep watching it emerge. She simply stood very still, her hand pressed flat against the loom's warm frame, and understood, for the first time since that cold chamber in Chelmsford, exactly what her husband had left her, buried in a locked cabinet, without either of them ever quite knowing in his lifetime how much it might eventually be worth. I need you to sit with me a moment here, because what happened next is the reason a mill everyone had already buried came back to life faster than anyone in that county thought possible. And I promise you, it very nearly didn't happen at all. Word of the mechanism's success did not travel quickly at first, and Eleanor understood through Obadiah's careful counsel exactly why she needed to guard that particular silence with some care. A mill without workers, however clever its new mechanism, could not fulfill a contract of any meaningful size, and Eleanor had, by that summer, precisely 4 employees to her name. Obadiah himself returned to proper work despite his age. 2 of the village boys who had helped clear the mill race the previous autumn, now trained carefully in the new loom's operation, and a young woman named Sarah Pratt, widowed young herself, who had walked 8 miles from a neighboring parish upon hearing, through channels Eleanor never fully traced, that Ravensmere Mill was hiring again, under new and, it was rumored, unusually fair management. 4 workers, 1 improved loom, and 11 ordinary looms still standing silent for want of hands enough to run them. It was not, by any reasonable measure, yet a business capable of competing against the established silk houses of Spitalfields or Macclesfield, and Eleanor understood this with the same clear-eyed honesty she brought to every column of her careful ledger. But it was, she reasoned, sitting alone one evening, with Thomas's pattern book spread before her, and bobbin curled warm against her side, considerably more than nothing, and considerably more than the Duke had ever expected her to manage from a mill he'd been entirely certain would ruin her. She wrote that same week to a silk merchant in London with whom her own father had once maintained a modest but honest trading relationship, a careful man named Ezra Whitlock, who had, she recalled, always valued reliability over grandeur in his suppliers. She did not exaggerate what Ravensmere could presently offer. She described the improved loom honestly, its capacity for complex figured work at a speed she believed, based on Kemp's own careful calculations, to considerably exceed the ordinary industry standard, and she offered, as proof, a small sample of the flawless silk the trial run had produced. Whitlock's reply arrived within a fortnight, considerably warmer than Eleanor had allowed herself to expect. He proposed a modest initial commission, cautious but genuine, 3 lengths of figured damask for a client he described only as a gentleman of consequence undertaking renovations to a country house, payment upon satisfactory delivery, with the clear implication that further commissions would follow should the work prove as fine as the sample suggested. Eleanor accepted immediately. The work occupied the better part of 6 weeks, Obadiah and Sarah Pratt working the improved loom in careful rotation, while the village boys managed the winding and preparation work the finished weaving required, and Eleanor herself spending long hours in the design room, refining, with Obadiah's patient guidance, the exact pattern specifications the commission required. She recorded every expense against the contract with particular care, understanding that this first true test of the mill's viability needed to demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt that Ravensmere could operate as a genuine and profitable concern, rather than simply a curiosity that had briefly delayed an otherwise inevitable failure. Wages for 4 workers across 6 weeks, £11 4 shillings. Raw silk thread, purchased at considerable expense from a supplier Whitlock himself recommended, £19. Dyes, careful matching required for the client's specified colors, £4 10 shillings. The commission, when finally delivered, earned Ravensmere £42. Eleanor sat with that figure a long while the evening the payment arrived, turning it over her mind against every warning she had been given in that cold Chelmsford chamber nearly a year before. A profit, however modest, against a mill everyone had assured her would swallow whatever she put into it and return nothing at all. She did not weep over the figure. She had, by that point, largely stopped weeping over anything that could still be recorded plainly in a ledger, having learned that the numbers themselves carried considerably more weight standing alone on the page than any tears she might have added to them. She wept once that autumn, alone in the design room with Bobbin curled against her side and Thomas's pattern books spread open before her, understanding fully and for the first time that her husband had genuinely loved this trade, had genuinely possessed the kind of quiet, careful skill that deserved considerably better than the desperate borrowed ambition that eventually consumed him, and that she was, in some manner she had not anticipated when she first forced open that locked cabinet, finally giving him the recognition his own choices had denied him in life. She never told that anyone, beyond Bobbin, who offered no judgment on the subject beyond a low, contented sound and the warm, steady weight of her presence against Eleanor's side until the grief had passed. Whitlock's second commission arrived within the month, considerably larger than the first, and Eleanor understood, reviewing the proposed terms by candlelight, that Ravensmere Mill had, against every warning offered her, genuinely begun to work. The Duke visited Ravensmere for the first time in over 2 years on a grey afternoon in the mill's second full autumn, and Eleanor understood, watching his carriage approach along the lane, that word of the mill's improbable recovery had finally travelled far enough to reach even the circles that had once been so entirely certain of its failure. The Duke walked the mill yard slowly, examining the repaired wheel turning steady in the mill race, the cleared and functioning workspace within, the modest but genuine activity of workers moving purposefully between the ordinary looms and the single improved mechanism that had, Eleanor understood now, become the mill's true and considerable value. "Mrs. Foss," he said finally, "Your Grace, I confess I did not expect to find quite this when I decided the drive was worth taking." "Few people do," Eleanor said. "That was rather the difficulty with the mill's reputation. Everyone assumed the failure was the whole of the story." The Duke studied the improved loom for a long moment, watching Sarah Pratt work it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had, over 2 years, become genuinely skilled at its operation. "What is this mechanism?" he asked. "My husband's design, found among papers he left in the mill's old design room. I've had it built and tested against ordinary commercial demand for the better part of a year now. It performs considerably faster than the traditional apparatus, without any loss to the quality of the finished silk." Something in the Duke's expression shifted, careful and calculating in a manner Eleanor recognized uncomfortably from that first cold meeting in Chelmsford. "I warned you this mill would ruin you," he said. "You did," Eleanor agreed. "I find myself rather considerably mistaken." "You do," Eleanor said, and allowed herself, for the first time in his presence, the smallest genuine satisfaction of saying so plainly. The Duke was quiet a long moment, watching the wheel turn steady beyond the yard, the whole mill alive around him with a purposeful industry it had not possessed in years before Eleanor's arrival. "I'll not pretend I came here purely from curiosity," he said. "I've had a difficult 2 years myself, Mrs. Foss. Poor harvests, certain unwise investments made under my father's stewardship that I've spent considerable effort attempting to correct since inheriting the title. My own estate's finances are, at present, rather more strained than I'd like any tenant or acquaintance to properly understand." "I'm sorry to hear it," Eleanor said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she genuinely meant it, despite everything. "I've come," the Duke continued, "to ask whether you might consider selling the mill back to the estate, at whatever fair price your own ledgers suggest is appropriate. I understand the reversion clause has, by now, entirely expired in your favor, and I've no legal claim upon the property beyond whatever you'd freely negotiate. But I find myself, Mrs. Foss, considerably in need of a reliable source of income the estate's traditional holdings no longer sufficiently provide, and this mill, which I once considered entirely worthless, appears to have become precisely that." Eleanor looked at him a long moment, and thought of the cold Chelmsford chamber, of the warning delivered so plainly and so certainly, of 2 years spent proving, shilling by careful shilling, exactly how wrong that certainty had been. She thought, too, of Bobbin watching patiently from the design-room window, of Obadiah's careful loyalty, of Sarah Pratt's 8-mile walk towards a mill that had offered her, when little else had, a fair and honest chance. "I'll not sell it back. I'm sorry, Your Grace, if that disappoints you, but I've built considerably too much here, across too difficult a road, to hand it back simply because the man who once warned me it would fail has now discovered he needs it to succeed." The Duke absorbed this without visible anger, though something in his composed expression suggested the answer had cost him considerably more than his careful manner allowed him to show. "I understand," he said. "I'd hoped, I confess, for a different answer, but I find I can hardly argue the fairness of your reasoning, given how thoroughly I once assured you this exact outcome was impossible." "You might," Eleanor said, "consider a different arrangement if the estate genuinely requires reliable income rather than mere ownership. Ravensmere has capacity, with proper investment, to expand considerably beyond what I've managed so far with 4 workers and a single improved loom. I'd welcome a partnership, Your Grace, on fair and clearly recorded terms, should you find yourself willing to invest in a business rather than simply reclaim one." The Duke was quiet a long moment, studying her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something closer to genuine respect than the careful, guarded skepticism he had carried through every previous exchange between them. "I'll consider it," he said finally. "I confess I hadn't expected, arriving here today, to leave having been offered a partnership by the very woman I once warned would lose everything." "Life carries a great many surprises, Your Grace," Eleanor said. "I've found these past 2 years that the ones worth trusting are generally the ones a person has to work considerably hard to earn." The partnership was formalized within the month, terms recorded carefully in a document Eleanor herself reviewed line by line with a solicitor of her own choosing, ensuring the arrangement preserved her full and unconditional ownership of the mill itself, while granting the Duke's estate a fair share of future profit against his own investment in expanding the operation considerably beyond its present modest scale. The investment came in the spring of the mill's 3rd full year, and it came substantially. 6 additional looms brought into full working order, 8 new workers hired from Thorncombe and the surrounding parishes, trained carefully by Obadiah and Sarah Pratt in both the traditional apparatus and, for the most skilled among them, the improved mechanism Thomas's own quiet genius had first sketched in a design room nobody else had troubled to examine. Eleanor recorded every figure of that expansion with the same careful discipline she had applied since her very first evening at Ravensmere, and found, reviewing the mill's full accounts at the close of that 3rd year, a total that would have seemed to the woman who had once sat rigid in a cold Chelmsford chamber and been told plainly she would lose everything, considerably more like fiction than honest arithmetic. £218 in net profit across the year, against a mill the Duke himself had once assessed as entirely without value. Whitlock's commissions had grown by then into a standing arrangement supplying 3 separate London clients on a regular quarterly basis, the improved loom's particular capability for complex, figured silk having become, through careful and quiet reputation, something close to a genuine specialty within the trade. Eleanor did not weep reviewing the final figures. She simply closed the ledger and sat a long moment in the design room's familiar quiet, Bobbin curled warm and considerably grayer now against her side, and allowed herself for the first time since her husband's death nearly 4 years before the genuine and uncomplicated satisfaction of having built something entirely her own out of a warning everyone had assured her was simply the truth. The mill wheel turned steadily beyond the window, the sound of it low and constant and entirely reliable, and somewhere below, across the mill's full and busy floor, 12 looms worked in careful coordination, weaving silk that would travel within the month to London houses that had once considered a widow's small provincial mill entirely beneath their notice. Obadiah Rowe found her there that evening, the design room lit only by a single candle, and set down, without comment, a fresh pot of tea beside her ledger. "Your husband would be proud," he said quietly. "I knew him only briefly all those years back, but I'd wager he never once imagined this exact outcome for those drawings he left behind." "No, I don't imagine he did." "Nor did the Duke, I'd wager, when he warned you off the whole enterprise." Eleanor smiled, the first genuinely easy smile Obadiah had seen from her in the whole of their long acquaintance. "No," she said, "he most certainly did not." By the mill's 4th year, Ravensmere had become, by common county reputation, among the finest producers of figured silk outside London itself, its improved loom mechanism copied under proper license, Eleanor negotiated carefully and profitably, by 2 other mills willing to pay handsomely for the privilege of the design her husband had once sketched, alone and unrecognized, in a room nobody else had thought worth entering. Obadiah Rowe worked the mill floor still, considerably slower now with age, but unwilling, he said plainly, to retire from the one place he'd finally seen properly restored to what it deserved to be. Sarah Pratt had risen over 4 careful years to oversee the mill's full weaving operation herself, her own 8-mile walk toward uncertain opportunity having become in time a permanent and thoroughly earned position of genuine consequence. Duke Aldous Rothburn visited Ravensmere considerably more than the partnership's formal terms strictly required, and Eleanor had by the 4th year stopped pretending to herself or to Obadiah's carefully raised eyebrow whenever the Duke's carriage appeared along the lane, that these visits were purely a matter of business oversight. Bobbin remained at Ravensmere through it all, grayer and slower now, but still keeping her careful watch from the design room window, still curling warm through every long evening spent over the ledger's patient columns, the mill's oldest and most constant witness to everything it had become. On a warm afternoon in the mill's 5th year, Eleanor stood in the yard, watching the wheel turn steady and reliable in the mill race she had once cleared with her own hands through a bitter autumn week, and found herself thinking, as she often did now, of that cold chamber in Chelmsford, of the warning delivered so plainly by a man entirely certain of her failure. She had lost a husband. She had very nearly lost, in the desperate months after his death, every remaining certainty she had once possessed about her own worth and capability. But she had not lost the mill. She had built it, instead, patiently and honestly, out of nothing more remarkable than a locked cabinet, a careful ledger, and a stubborn refusal to accept a warning as though it were already, inevitably, the truth. The Duke warned her she'd lose everything because he genuinely believed the mill was already ruined beyond saving. He was wrong, because it turns out the only thing truly beyond saving was his own certainty. And 3 years later, he was the one asking to buy back what he'd once been so entirely sure was worthless. If Ravensmere's wheel turned for you like it turned for Eleanor, comment "The Wheel Turns" below. Tell us where you're watching from, and hit subscribe so the next story finds you. The next one is already waiting.